Chapter 10 of the Tale of Daddy Longlegs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Tale of Daddy Longlegs by Arthur Scott Bailey. Chapter 10 Ride by Moonlight. It was not exactly a pleasant ride that Daddy Longlegs had in the toe of Peter Mink's shoe. Not only was it dark pocket inside the shoe, but it was so cramped that Daddy was most uncomfortable. And what was still worse, he hadn't even the faintest idea where he was going. Sometimes Daddy was almost sure that Peter Mink was carrying him around Blue Mountain, and at other times he thought that Peter must be following Swift River to see where it went, perhaps. Anyhow, Daddy suffered such a pitching and tossing and tumbling and jouncing as he had never known in all his life. Then at last, to Daddy's great relief, Peter Mink kept quite still for a long time. That was when Peter burrowed into a haystack to take a nap. And since it was then many hours past Daddy Longlegs' regular bedtime, he went to sleep too. But he awoke with a great start when Peter Mink crawled out of his shelter about dawn. And at first Daddy couldn't imagine what was happening. But after he had been bounced about a bit, he remembered the terrible accident that had happened to him in Jimmy Rabbit's shoe shop in the meadow. Suddenly Peter Mink stopped, and to Daddy Longlegs' great delight, Peter began to take off his shoes. Yes, Peter Mink removed his shoes. And then he removed himself. That is to say, he dropped his shoes carelessly upon the ground, for that was his way, and took himself off. Daddy Longlegs waited until Peter Mink had stolen away, and then he dashed out of the shoe much faster than he had entered it in the evening before. Yes, the evening before, for now it was the following morning, and broad daylight. Daddy Longlegs stretched his 8 legs, first one after another, and then all together. He was so glad to escape from his cramped quarters that he had little thought for anything except the joy of being free once more. Then he remembered all at once that he was lost, and that was enough to start his 8 legs to shaking beneath him in a very unpleasant fashion. Daddy Longlegs was frightened. Anybody could have seen that. After a few moments he looked about him, wondering which way he had better go. And as he gazed at his surroundings he saw, not far off, a familiar-looking object. At first Daddy could scarcely believe his eyes, and he looked steadily at what he saw, as if he half expected it would fly away and vanish. But the object did nothing of the kind, and how could it, anyhow? Because it was Farmer Green's house that had caught Daddy Longlegs' eye. And there stood the great barn too, a little way off. And there was the bridge across Swift River. Without knowing what he was doing, Peter Mink had brought Daddy Longlegs almost home. And then he had taken off his shoes because he wanted to go for a swim in the duck pond, in the hope of catching an eel for his breakfast. Well, Daddy Longlegs lost no time in making his way back to the stone wall by the roadside, and the first person he met there was no other than little Miss Ladybug, who seemed delighted to see him and asked him how he liked working for Farmer Green. "Yes, it's a fine day," said Daddy Longlegs. "The rain is holding off, and it looks as if Farmer Green was going to get his oats harvested without their being wet, after all. "I see you're deaf today," Mrs. Ladybug observed in a pitying tone. "It's a shame. And Farmer Green ought to be very grateful to you for your help." "He hasn't said a word to me," Daddy Longlegs told her. And Mrs. Ladybug declared she couldn't understand it. But there were many other things, too, that she didn't understand. She had heard that Daddy was a harvestman. But she didn't know that some people called him by that name merely because he was seen in Pleasant Valley about the time Farmer Green harvested his crops. As for working in the fields, Daddy Longlegs knew no more about that than did that fat drone, Buster Bumblebee. And Farmer Green would have laughed heartily at the idea of either of them helping him. Chapter 10